The phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, jolting me out of my focus. The sweltering midday sun bore down on the makeshift clinic, where I'd been working for the past few weeks, yet the sudden chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the heat. I wiped the sweat from my brow, stepped outside, and glanced at the screen. Richard. My stomach twisted. I debated whether to answer. Calls from him were never good news. Over the years, I had learned that much. Richard never reached out unless he wanted something, and even then, it was never anything that benefited me. My instinct told me to ignore it, but curiosity, maybe even the tiniest shred of hope, got the better of me. Hello? I kept my tone neutral, bracing myself for whatever nonsense he had to spew. Catherine. His voice was far too cheerful, a forced exuberance that immediately set off alarms in my mind. Just thought you'd like to know I sold the mountain cabin. My breath caught. You did what? I must have misheard him. There was no way. He couldn't have. Sold it, he repeated, his tone exasperatingly casual. As if he were discussing the weather. As if he hadn't just stolen something irreplaceable from me. Don't look so shocked. It was for the greater good. Well, mine, obviously. And then he had the audacity to laugh. A smug, self-satisfied chuckle that made my blood boil. You had no right. I snapped, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded, rage flooding my veins, drowning out everything else. That cabin wasn't yours to sell. Relax, he drawled, utterly unbothered by the sheer audacity of what he had done. I've been managing things around here while you're off playing hero. And besides, what's the point of holding on to something you're never around to enjoy? It was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later. I felt dizzy. The sheer entitlement in his voice, the way he spoke as if he had done me a favor, as if the cabin was his to decide the fate of it, was infuriating. I'll thank you when hell freezes over. My voice was shaking now, but not with fear. With pure, undiluted fury. Before he could say another word, I hung up. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The world around me blurred, my mind reeling from what I had just heard. Richard had crossed a line. And he had no idea what was coming for him. I stood frozen, my phone still clenched in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. Richard had sold the cabin. Or at least, he thought he had. My mind whirred, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. That cabin wasn't just some property, it was a part of me, a place filled with memories, laughter, and the kind of peace I could never find anywhere else. And now, he had taken it upon himself to strip it away from me. Anger burned hot in my veins, but underneath it was something else, a spark of something colder, more calculating. Richard had always believed he could bulldoze through anything, that he could take what he wanted without consequence. But this time, he had miscalculated. I took a slow, steadying breath and pulled up my contacts, my thumb hovering over one name. Laura. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice warm and cheerful. Hey, Kathy. What's up? I didn't waste time. Richard sold the cabin. Silence. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice tight with disbelief. He what? I could almost see her reaction, her eyes narrowing, her grip tightening on the phone as she processed the sheer audacity of it. Apparently, he needed the money, I bit out, and decided our home was the perfect sacrifice. But here's the thing, he legally couldn't sell it. Not without you. I heard her exhale sharply. Our co-ownership agreement. Exactly. Relief flickered through my fury. Richard thought he had won, but he hadn't even checked the paperwork. He assumed that because I was far away, he could do whatever he pleased. But what he didn't know, what he had failed to even consider, was that I had made sure the cabin was protected. Laura's voice was firm. There's no way he could have finalized the sale without both our signatures. Did he even bother reading the contract? I let out a bitter laugh. You know Richard. He thinks rules don't apply to him. Well, he's about to learn otherwise. I could hear the steel in her voice. I'll pull up the legal documents. We'll make sure this deal doesn't go through. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The fight wasn't over yet. Richard wasn't the type to back down easily, and if he had already gotten someone to agree to buy the cabin, then he would try everything to make sure the sale went through. But he had underestimated me. I wasn't that scared teenager anymore. And this time, I wasn't going to let him win. Hanging up the call with Laura, I felt the first surge of control return to me. Richard had played his usual game, acting as if he was untouchable, as if his word alone was enough to make something true. But this time, he had made a critical mistake. He assumed that because I was away, I wouldn't fight back. But I was fighting back. And I wasn't alone. Within minutes, Laura had sent me a scanned copy of the co-ownership agreement, highlighting the clause that explicitly stated, neither party may sell or transfer ownership of the property without the express written consent of the other. It was ironclad, leaving no room for interpretation. I stared at the document, my hands tightening into fists. Richard had always underestimated me, always assumed I was too naive, too soft to challenge him. Maybe that had been true when I was younger, when I still clung to the hope that he could be reasoned with. But now? Now, I was ready to fight. The moment I saw Laura's name pop up on my screen again, I picked up. So, what's the plan? She asked without preamble. We stop this before it goes any further. My voice was firm. I'll be back home as soon as I can. In the meantime, I need you to gather every legal document we have, our agreement, past property tax records, anything that proves he had no right to sell. Already on it. I could hear the determination in her tone, and it sent a renewed sense of purpose through me. Richard might have tried to do this behind our backs, but he wasn't going to get away with it. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. We should also get a lawyer involved. If we wait too long, he might try to push the sale through under the table. Agreed. Laura's voice sharpened. I know someone who specializes in real estate disputes. I'll reach out to them today and get their advice on the next steps. If Richard thinks he can scam his way through this, he's in for a rude awakening. A bitter smirk curled up my lips. He really thought he could sell something that doesn't even belong to him. And worse? That we wouldn't notice. Yeah, well, let's remind him exactly who he's dealing with. As I ended the call, I felt a new fire burning inside me. This wasn't just about a cabin, it was about taking back control, about standing up for myself. Richard had crossed a line. And he was about to learn that I wasn't the same girl he used to push around. I barely slept that night. My mind spun relentlessly, replaying every word Richard had said, every smug inflection of his voice, every time he had dismissed my anger as if I were nothing more than a child throwing a tantrum. But he had made one fatal mistake: he underestimated me. The next morning, I threw myself into action. If I was going to fight this, I needed evidence. I needed proof of his deception. Laura had already pulled up our co-ownership agreement, and I spent an hour going through every detail again, making sure there were no loopholes Richard could exploit. There weren't. The contract was airtight. He had no authority to sell the cabin without Laura's consent. That alone would be enough to invalidate any sale, but I wanted more. I wanted to know exactly how far he had gone. After a deep breath, I dialed the number of the real estate agent listed on a previous inquiry for the cabin. When she picked up, her tone was polite but wary. "This is Catherine Daniels. I co-own the mountain cabin that Richard Daniels claims to have sold." I kept my voice steady, professional. "I need to clarify some legal discrepancies." There was a pause. Then, cautiously, she said, "IOL, I wasn't aware there was a co-owner." My stomach tightened. There it is. So, Richard didn't mention me at all? Another pause. A sigh. No. He told me he had full control over the sale. I clenched my jaw. Of course he did. "Listen," I said, keeping my anger in check. "I'm not trying to cause trouble for you, but this sale is fraudulent. Our agreement explicitly states that neither of us can sell without the other's consent." The agent exhaled sharply. That explains why something felt off. I flagged the sale as suspicious because the buyer wanted to pay in cash, and Richard was pushing for a rushed closing. I've been in real estate long enough to know when someone's cutting corners. "He's not just cutting corners," I said, my voice cold. "He's committing fraud." She hesitated. "Would you like me to send you the signed documents?" A sense of grim satisfaction filled me. Yes. That would be very helpful. By the time I ended the call, I had what I needed: proof that Richard had lied, that he had falsified a sale under false pretenses. When Laura called later, I relayed everything to her. "The sale hasn't gone through yet," I said, "but Richard was trying to push it forward quickly. If we hadn't caught this in time, we might have lost the cabin for good." Laura let out a low whistle. "Well, now we have him cornered. What's our next move?" I exhaled, a small smirk forming. "We take this to the lawyer and then? We make sure Richard never tries this again." I had barely set my bags down when my phone buzzed. Richard. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, letting him stew in his own mess, but then I thought better of it. No. It was time to face him. I swiped to answer. "What do you want, Richard?" My voice was sharp, cutting straight to the point. His tone, smug as ever, sent a fresh wave of rage through me. "Just checking in. Hope you're not too upset about the whole cabin situation. No use crying over spilled milk, right?" I gritted my teeth, my grip tightening on the phone. "Funny you should say that," I said, keeping my voice level despite the fury simmering beneath. "Because as far as I can tell, the sale never happened." A beat of silence. Then, his voice lost its easy arrogance. "What are you talking about?" "Laura and I checked the ownership records," I continued, my words laced with ice. "The sale is invalid. You can't sell something that doesn't belong to you." Another pause, longer this time. I had struck a nerve. Then, his voice hardened. "That's ridiculous. The buyer paid in cash. The paperwork is done." I let out a cold laugh. "No, Richard. It's not. Without Laura's signature, the sale is legally worthless. And guess what? The real estate agent flagged the transaction as suspicious. She's already handed over the documents. We have proof that you tried to sell the cabin under false pretenses. His breath hitched just for a second. He knew he was cornered. But, as always, he tried to turn it around. You think you're so smart, don't you? He spat. Always playing the perfect daughter. Always trying to control everything. You have no idea how hard I've had it. I did what I had to do. I felt a surge of fury, but this time, I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I leaned into the cold, unwavering truth. No, Richard. You stole from me. And now, you're going to face the consequences. His voice wavered, the bravado starting to crack. You wouldn't really go to the authorities, would you? I smiled. A slow, deliberate, dangerous smile he couldn't see, but he could hear it in my voice. Try me. For the first time in my life, Richard had nothing to say. No snide remark, no manipulation, no guilt trip. Just silence. Then, like the coward he was, he hung up. I stood there, heart pounding, my hands trembling not with fear, but with triumph. For years, I had let Richard push me around, let him make me feel powerless. Not anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin. This was about me. And I had finally won. The next morning, I woke up with a clear purpose. No more hesitation. No more letting Richard manipulate his way out of trouble. Laura and I finalized the cease and desist letter and sent it directly to Richard. The language was precise, firm, and merciless. Any further attempt to claim ownership of the cabin or involve the buyer would lead to immediate legal action. For once, Richard was up against something he couldn't talk his way out of. I barely had time to process the relief when my phone rang. Detective Miller. My pulse quickened. This was it. Miss Daniels, he began, his voice calm but authoritative. We've reviewed the documents you and Miss Langley provided. It's clear that the sale was unauthorized. Based on the evidence, we're prepared to move forward with a formal investigation. If you'd like, we can escalate this to potential fraud charges. My breath hitched. I had known this was coming, had wanted it to come, but hearing it confirmed out loud sent a rush of adrenaline through me. Yes, I said without hesitation. I want to pursue this. Richard thought he could gamble away my home and walk away unscathed. He was wrong. Detective Miller continued, we'll start by contacting the buyer and explaining the situation. If Richard continues to interfere, we'll escalate to criminal charges. Criminal charges. For the first time, Richard wouldn't just face my anger, he would face the law. I hung up, my hands still trembling as a mix of triumph and fury coursed through me. I didn't have long to savor the victory before my phone rang again. Richard. I let it ring twice, just to let him stew, before I picked up. His voice was laced with anger, but beneath it, I heard something else: desperation. Do you have any idea what you've done, Catherine? You're ruining everything. I let out a cold, humorless laugh. No, Richard. I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself. His tone turned venomous. You've always been so ungrateful. I stepped in when your mother couldn't handle things, and this is how you repay me? I clenched my jaw, but this time, His words didn't sink in. They didn't make me doubt myself like they used to. You didn't step in, Richard. You took over. You lied, manipulated, and used people for your own gain. And now, for the first time, you're facing real consequences. There was silence. A long, tense pause where I could feel his world crumbling. And then, he did what he always did when he lost control, he hung up. I exhaled, staring at my phone, my heart still hammering in my chest. Richard had spent years believing he was untouchable. But this time, he had lost. For good. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Richard. Miss Daniels, Detective Miller's voice came through the receiver, steady and professional. We've spoken with the buyer, and they've agreed to halt the transaction. They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and are fully cooperating with our investigation. I exhaled, tension draining from my shoulders. It was over. So, that means the sale is officially voided? I asked, gripping the phone tightly. Yes, Detective Miller confirmed. The cabin remains under your and Miss Langley's ownership. However, given Richard's actions, we are proceeding with charges of fraudulent misrepresentation and attempted theft of property. The words hit like a tidal wave, powerful, final. Richard wasn't just caught. He was facing real consequences. I took a slow breath. Thank you, Detective. Please keep me updated. As I hung up, a wave of relief and triumph washed over me. He lost. After years of manipulation, deception, and selfishness, Richard had finally backed himself into a corner he couldn't escape from. I immediately dialed Laura. She picked up after the first ring. It's done, I told her, the excitement bubbling in my voice. The sale is void. The cabin is ours again. There was a beat of silence before she let out a victorious laugh. I knew it. God, I wish I could see the look on his face right now. I smirked, imagining Richard's reaction as he realized his little scheme had completely fallen apart. The desperation in his voice during our last conversation had been just the beginning now. He was officially out of options. What about him? Laura asked, voice steady but curious. I leaned back, staring out the window at the familiar sight of the mountains in the distance. The police are moving forward with their investigation. If Richard tries anything else, they'll escalate to full criminal charges. Laura let out a low whistle. About time someone stood up to him. Her words stuck with me long after we ended the call. For years, I had let Richard get away with so much: his manipulation, his entitlement, his complete disregard for boundaries. But this time? I had fought back. And I had won. That evening, I drove to the cabin. The moment I stepped inside, a sense of peace settled over me. The familiar scent of pine, the gentle creak of the floorboards, it was still mine. Richard had tried to take it from me. But in the end, I had taken back everything he thought he could steal. And the days that followed, I found myself settling back into a new kind of peace. Not just the relief that came from knowing the cabin was safe, but something deeper, something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. For so long, Richard had been a looming presence in my life. Even when he wasn't around, the weight of his manipulation, his constant attempts to control everything, had always been there. But now? That weight was gone. Laura and I spent the next few weekends at the cabin, restoring it piece by piece. We painted the porch, patched up the roof, and planted new wildflowers along the pathway leading to the front door. Each nail hammered, each brushstroke applied, felt like more than just home improvement, it felt like reclaiming what was mine. One afternoon, as we stood on the porch, watching the golden light of the sunset stretch over the mountains, Laura turned to me. "So," she said, a knowing look in her eyes, "what's next for you, Kathy? You've taken back the cabin, stood up to Richard, what's the next big move?" I thought about her question, letting it settle in my mind. For so long, my life had been about reacting, dealing with Richard, handling problems as they came. But now, for the first time, I could think about what I actually wanted. A slow smile spread across my lips. I'm going to keep doing what I love: volunteering, traveling, living on my own terms. But this time, I'm not letting anyone else dictate how I live it. Laura grinned and raised her glass. To that. We clinked our glasses together, laughter spilling into the cool mountain air. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, wrapped in the warmth of the cabin, I let myself reflect on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the fight, the victory. But most of all, the lesson. I had spent years trying to keep the peace, avoiding conflict, letting Richard get away with things just to make life easier. But this time, I had drawn a line. And I had held it. The cabin stood as a symbol of that growth. A reminder that I didn't have to sacrifice my peace, my values, or my happiness for someone else's comfort. And as the fire crackled beside me, the stars twinkling outside, I knew one thing for certain: I was finally, truly in control of my life. In the weeks that followed, life slowly settled into a new kind of rhythm. The cabin, once a battleground for Richard's greed, was now a place of healing again. Each morning, I would step onto the porch, coffee in hand, and take in the view of the mountains stretching endlessly before me. It was mine. Not just in ownership, but in spirit. I had fought for it, and I had won. I didn't hear much from Richard after the charges were filed. There were no more smug phone calls, no more attempts to manipulate me into submission. It was almost strange, the silence where his chaos used to be. But it was a welcome kind of strange. My mother called once. Her voice was hesitant, almost reluctant. "You know how he gets, Catherine," she said, her usual defense of him ringing hollow this time. I closed my eyes, exhaling. I do. And that's why I did what I had to do. For the first time, she didn't argue. There was no pleading, no guilt-tripping. Just a long pause before she finally sighed. "I hope you find peace." I already have, I thought. But I didn't say it, I didn't need to. Instead, I spent my time rebuilding, not just the cabin, but myself. Laura and I continued making small renovations, fixing the fence, restaining the wood panels, planting new flowers along the edge of the property. Each improvement was a reminder that I was in control now. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink, Laura turned to me. "So, what's next?" she asked, her voice light but full of meaning. "You've taken back the cabin, stood up to Richard, what comes after this?" I thought about her question, letting it settle deep inside me. For so long, my life had been defined by reacting to Richard, to problems, to obligations that were never mine to bear. But now? Now, I got to decide. A slow, confident smile spread across my lips. I keep living. I keep doing what I love: volunteering, traveling, working hard for what matters to me. But this time? I do it on my own terms. Laura grinned, raising her glass. to that. We clinked glasses, and I let out a breath, feeling lighter than I had in years. For so long, I had let Richard define my battles. But now, standing here, in the home I had fought for, I knew this was my victory. And this time, no one was going to take it from me.